I am Liza Wood. I am a PhD student at University of California, Davis, like Kara said. And today I will be talking about my research that I've been doing in partnership with Organic Seed Alliance that we're calling Assessing the Resilience of the Organic Seed System, a Network Perspective. And I will go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, so the overarching premise for this presentation is that the challenges facing the agricultural system really call for systems level solutions. And I don't want to dwell too much on those challenges because I think many of us are already familiar with them between concentration in the seed system, biodiversity loss, and climate change. But the idea of systems level change is something that we hear from both practitioners in the seed world and from academic researchers. So for instance, one thing that has really inspired my research, starting my PhD, that was 4 years ago now, is the Organic Seed Alliance's State of Organic Seed report from 2016. And I'm going to ask one more technical question when I do that with my screen. Does it zoom in and out for all of you, or does it cooperate?
Looks stable.
Okay, great. Okay, so the Organic Seed Alliance sort of laid out some language that really particularly motivated me when I started thinking about my PhD, which is that they talk about reestablishing a more resilient food system in the face of climate change, and that it requires a whole systems approach based on proactive solutions. They also made a recommendation to create regional and national seed producer networks. So saying that many organic seed producers are challenged by a lack of access to appropriate seed harvesting and cleaning equipment, and that strengthening these networks will support the success of the current organic seed producers and help new growers enter the market. And of course, this is what many of us are at this conference for, right? To network, to learn, to build community in seed. And this is because it can help with market challenges, help grow a knowledge base, and maybe even help get seed. And so we may all already be convinced that networks are really important, and maybe that's why we're here. But this is what I'm going to be digging into for this hour. So first, what does it mean to think about seed from a systems perspective? Because we can start with seed as the breeding material, right? But then there are, of course, researchers and breeders who are helping develop this material. They may be working with different companies or organizations to disseminate it. And of course, there are the farmers and seed producers and advocates who are also actively involved in planting and cultivating this material. And we're all sort of knitted together in this massive web or network that really, when we think about it as a network, starts to demonstrate our interdependencies. And what a lot of academic research says sounds a lot like the Organic Seed Alliance State of Seed report in 2016, which is that networks are a really important lever for systems level change. So this happens in a lot of different ways. It's that we have information networks that diffuse new ideas and promote social learning. The supply chain connections that we have in the network can either support or hinder changes a grower or seed producer might want to make. And also seed exchange networks can really increase the biodiversity that's available to us. So by creating informal spaces like these in this network. But despite a whole suite of different actors saying that networks are really important, it's actually rarely studied as a whole. So you can see this figure of funded projects for organic seed. And the orange sliver is what's referred to as sort of the systems development research. But by and large, what we see is that between 1996 and 2016, at least, organic funding research has been really largely dedicated to breeding and variety trials. And then areas like policy or enterprise development, seed production, and systems development just really aren't given as much attention. And personally, I think it's rare because it's quite a complicated thing to wrap your head around. Systems level thinking doesn't sit in any one category. And while it's really important, it can be hard to take tangible lessons learned away from systems level studies. So for that reason, I really appreciate everyone in this session, because this presentation will be slightly more abstract maybe than others at this conference. And I am just going to try to situate it as meaningfully as I can. But to try to address this research gap, a few years ago, almost 2 years ago now, I reached out to Kiki Hubbard and Jared Zeistro at Organic Seed Alliance because I felt like Organic Seed Alliance was one of the few groups that I could really find that had such a systems level vision for seed. And so I really wanted to work with them. Also, as a PhD student, I wanted to use some of my skills that were at this sort of systems level analysis that had real policy implications. And so what happened was that Jared, Kiki, and I decidedly worked together towards publishing the State of Organic Seed report that will be coming out really within the coming months. So the 2022 report that I'm really excited for when it does come out, and you can all take a deeper dive into that. And what this presentation does is talks really in depth about one piece of that report, which is tackling sort of this systems level analysis. Because the questions that I sort of want to contribute to this area take a look at how do we quantify the organic seed system network, right? We may use this phrase a lot, but what does it really mean and what does it look like and how can we sort of probe it like we do other data? And what exactly do we want the organic seed system to achieve, right? There are a lot of sort of goals put out there, but how can we more explicitly define them and understand whether or not they are being achieved? So what this translates into are sort of two main research questions for this presentation today. And the first one is, how do seed stakeholders define a resilient seed system? And I'll put resilient seed system in air quotes here, because I asked folks really this question to sort of guide their thinking in what are the goals that you want to see from the seed system. But I do want to recognize one, I'll get a little bit into the methods later, but there was one response from a survey taker who did mention, blah to resilience as a word we universally use, get rid of it. It's a marketing toy, which I can really, I don't object to, right? There are lots of words that we use, and sustainability might be a good one potentially that, can be co-opted, can be used for greenwashing, can come to mean everything and nothing at the same time. But for the sake of this research, I really wanted to pick a phrase that maybe we could all think about and get behind and define in our own words so that seed stakeholders themselves can start defining the vision for what a resilient seed system means. And once we generated those definitions or collected them, we wanted to know, how does the organic seed network reflect these definitions? So in short, is it resilient? Which is quite a big question to ask. And I am beginning to try to answer that question in this presentation, although I'm glad that you're all here, because what I am really welcoming is feedback. What I'm presenting is very preliminary and is a pretty large topic. And so this is one of the reasons I'm excited to be here, is because I think that kind of collaboratively thinking and building this idea will be an important piece of the research. So a little bit about how to answer these really big questions and the methods that we used. So first, in collaboration with Organic Seed Alliance, we fielded surveys to a whole suite of organic seed stakeholders over the past 2 years. So this research for now focuses on the organic seed producers and companies that we surveyed, though I may expand the stakeholders involved in later analysis. But what we did was we sent out a bunch of online surveys to different seed producers and companies, over 500, and heard back from 127 of them, so about 24% of respondents. And we sent out these surveys across the US, and we'll say that most seed producers and companies are concentrated in the West. So while we have different numbers of what looks represented here, generally, we found that our responses were representative of each region. So we had about 24 or 25% response rate from the West, the North Central region, the Northeast, and the South. So we used particularly the USDA SARE regions and also some responses from Canada. And we have a lot of data from these surveys, which will all end up in the State of Organic Seed report. But what I want to focus on for right now is this question that we asked, which is saying, resilience is a word often used to talk about agriculture, but it means different things to different people. How do you define a resilient seed system? And please define a resilient seed system in your own words. So this is something, some of you may have actually taken this survey and answered this question already. If not, I think it is something to think about. I'd be curious for anyone's definition in this call, because it really is a chance to elicit, what do you envision for a seed system that is able to bounce back? How do we get there? What does it need? And we had over 100 definitions from our surveys. And so for this first section, I'm going to read out some of those responses and talk about how we were able to group them into some major topics. So here are 3 quotes that were pretty representative. I think there were a lot of consistent themes across the definitions. And so I'll take the time to read these out to you, because it is really nice to think about the voices of all of the seed producers and companies that responded to our survey. One responded that a resilient seed system is one that can succeed in the face of challenges of climate, political, and market force impacts. It utilizes a decentralized network of growers, provides widespread education and communication among all participants, and fosters cooperation and sharing for the benefit of all. And a resilient system is one that can absorb seasonal and annual disruptions and losses, a system that includes multiple crop types and multiple sources of revenue, so that one fails, and at least one always does, it doesn't seriously affect the whole. It's holistic management for the long view, the long game, the long haul, in the field, in the body, and in society. And a third definition, a seed system with good storage and high quality seeds germinate reliably for a long amount of time. Another definition would be a strong, knowledgeable, and dependable seed community of diverse farmers surrounding each regionalized seed system. And so you can imagine reading over 100 of these. Many of them are really inspiring. I think it had really beautiful ways of thinking about the seed system that they want to see, or maybe that they already experience. But as a researcher, my job was to say, okay, we have over 100 definitions. How do we make sense of them? And the way we went about doing this was sort of a qualitative coding approach, which means that we read each definition multiple times and all of the definitions multiple times, and then pull out some key themes that emerge and the phrases that people use that relate to those key themes. So I'll show you a bit of a toy example of that. So for instance, we might say that decentralization and regionalization is one of these big themes that we saw. So I would pull out the words that match this theme of decentralization and kind of put those all in one bucket. Then you also might notice another theme, something like information and education. So pulling out phrases like education and communication among all participants, as well as knowledgeable, seed communities, and put those in the information and education buckets. And there's also a theme, say, of diversity, both of crops and people. And so we can pull out phrases like multiple crop types and sources of revenue, as well as diverse farmers. And so we went through this approach for all 100 plus definitions. And what emerged were sort of 4 big themes, each with sort of some detailed descriptors in each. And so I'm going to go ahead and share and walk through how seed producers and companies defined a resilient system. And the first big theme or big bucket of phrases that came out of this work was these sort of higher level network characteristics. So it wasn't, it was more about what the system should do and how it should respond to stress. And the table that you see are sort of the codes or the sub themes that exist under this high level network characteristics category. How many times this high level category was mentioned, and then the counts of each code, the percentages, and then a word cloud, sort of the words that jump out a lot. So the bigger the word, the more they jumped out. So under this, you can see one of the biggest things that people mentioned in their definitions was that the system would be flexible, adaptable, resilient, resistant, sorry. And so you see words that jump out like adapt and withstand and maintain and bounce back and back up. So we're looking at these themes of being really flexible and adaptable, also being functional and productive, right? Still providing seed in a sustained way, which also requires having redundancies built into the system and making sure that it's an evolving process. A second big bucket of words and themes, we're thinking about the importance of scale in the network, both the scale and the scope. So sort of what areas of this cover, what areas does this cover, and how is it organized? So there's a lot of mention about networks needing to be kind of focused at the local or regional level. So mentioning region or regional was really one of the top words in all of the definitions. It was also pretty common to mention or put an emphasis on having the network be decentralized or having lots of different centers as opposed to sort of one concentrated solution. And there was also a bit of talk about the future orientation of how networks should be, that resilience doesn't mean just for now, but also for the future. A third theme was also really about the people in the network. So this wasn't just about seed, and this wasn't just about, say, climate resilience. It was really about who is in this network and how they're relating to one another. So I refer to this as the role of community, with the big themes being that the community had to be knowledgeable, that this idea of education and information sharing was really important, that the people should be really diverse. So this can't just be one group of people, right? It takes gardeners, it takes educators, it takes seed producers and breeders. It takes policies, it takes sort of whole communities to really create a resilient seed system. And in line with that, there was also some emphasis on this idea of cooperation, that not only do we need to have a diverse set of actors, but they also all need to be working together in a really particular way. And last, there was sort of this more general theme that got into the nitty-gritty of what the seed system itself should have. So what is it that seed producers want to make sure is happening in their seed system for it to be viable? And here there was a very large emphasis on diversity, particularly diverse crops, which you'll really see jump out in the word cloud. Diversity and diverse and genetic variety and crop variety and plant variety were really a centerpiece of this theme. But there was also emphasis on financial security and meeting demand, so sort of this provisional aspect of what a seed system should do, talking about the importance of maintaining organic agronomic practices, seed saving and banking, making sure that seed systems were accessible and that there were reliable infrastructures. So we sort of started with these high-level themes, and then thinking about what they should look like, how they should be organized, who is involved, and then what should the seed system and the seed and agronomic side of it actually look like. And so having put together all of these big bucket themes, the big jump here, and what we've been trying to do in this research, is to try to link what these definitions are saying into network measures and goals. So the big jump of how do we actually measure these things? How do we link resilience definitions to network measurements? And so first I want to pull out, even more specifically, what themes emerged from these definitions and how I translate them into network measures. So first, I'll say that together, seed producers from our survey identify that a resilient seed system should strike a balance of having a decentralized seed network that centers around the regional level. So that much was really clear, and that it involves both diverse seed and people, but at the same time, maintaining enough connectedness to support efficient flows of information and resources across the country. So there's some striking of a balance of having a really strong regional network, but also making sure that there is connectedness enough between regions to sort of help information flow. So for instance, we have this conference here. This is a great example of an information flow source at a national level. And what this breaks down to is that the goal really varies by scale. And so we have to look at both the national, regional, and individual levels to really understand what a resilient seed system should look like. So at the national scale, it seems like there's an interest in information centralization, but decentralized supply chain and genetic networks. At the regional scale, there's an emphasis on having centralized information and supply chain exchange, but decentralized genetic networks, and at the individual scale, connections with diverse people from both inside and outside the region. And the next half of this presentation sort of digs into what we see about these networks and how they match up to these sort of goals that seem to have emerged from the resilience definitions. But I do want to pause because there are a lot of potentially jargony things in here. We're starting to talk about scale. And so I just want to create a second for any questions, clarifying questions that might want to be asked. Okay. Note that you can feel free to pop in at any time if you have a question. So let's talk about networks and what a network really might look like. And I opened up the chat and this was a mistake. Now I can't undo it. Okay, well, anyways.
I had a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, feel free to ask.
Hey, this is Deborah. So related to the decentralizing process, was there a sense of like who they felt was responsible for that, you know, especially on the national and regional level? Did that within the system, was that who was responsible for making the decentralizing happen? Because centralizing, you know, is like we can make that, it's a little bit easier to bring people together, but then when you're not centralizing, who gets to make those decisions and how was that determined? Anything come out of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. No one really pointed to a how in a lot of these, which has been sort of the fun task of part 2 of this project, has been the what, and you know, what are we seeing, and then how do we match what we see to the vision or not. And so maybe the second half of this will at least help us brainstorm a little bit of the how, or yeah, of the who and who's responsible. But what I'm thinking is that I think that the how would at least be encouraging the building of regional networks. So in the end, I sort of point to really cool, there are so many forums at this conference even that are trying to generate regional networks. And instead of investing all of the resources in, say, just 1 or 2 groups in the country, really trying to diffuse the resources. And I'm thinking of recommendations like we make in the State of Organic Seed report that are about, you know, focusing on funding opportunities for smaller scale enterprises or for, you know, up and coming organizations or nonprofits that are trying to do more regionally based organizing, and changing policies and structures that can fund and support not just, you know, the big guy in town, but all of the little groups that are trying to sort of build something that's a little more geographically local.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so then before moving on, I noticed I put this big flag here, which is that I'm still developing, you know, I'm still listening to resilience definitions. I would, like I said, would love to hear any of yours, and still thinking about, you know, do these goals make sense for anyone who's listening? You know, are they resonating? Are they not? And so we can think about that as we sort of unpack what we're seeing in the networks. So how do we draw the network of the organic seed system? So I have the data collection slide back up, but this time we are looking at a different kind of question. So we're still working with surveys from seed producers and companies, but we're dealing with a different set of questions that we asked to help us map the network of organic seed producers. So what we asked in this survey, in addition to resilience definitions, is that we asked the survey takers who they get information from and collaborate with on research projects. You know, who do you have contracts with, buy, sell, and rent from? And who do you get breeding material from and exchange seed with? these are not always easy questions to answer and are not questions that everyone necessarily wants to share. But part of this is not so much to get individual answers to this, but to be able to get a really holistic picture sort of at the national scale and at a regional scale. And so this is what I will be sharing with you. But just briefly, I want to review sort of what we do with these networks and how we start to visualize them. And so first, remember, we've set out these goals. We say things like we want a centralized information flow, decentralized supply chains, everything I just reviewed. But what I have underlined are sort of these words that we all kind of know what they mean, but how the question for this research is, how do you measure them in a network, right? So what does it mean to be centralized or decentralized? And what exactly does it mean to be diverse? How do we clarify that? And so only on this slide will I sort of get a little bit into the analytical methods of social network analysis, but this is something that my research really focuses on. Questions like, how do you actually measure centralization and diversity in a network and understand statistically whether or not these things are present? But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, at least with understanding what these words mean. So let's say we have 4 different seed stakeholders or actors, which are represented by the blue circles on the right. And let's say that the dark blue are seed producers and the light blue are researchers, for instance. And we'd call the figure on the left centralized because 3 of the actors all connect to the center 4th actor, but not to one another. And we'd call the figure on the right decentralized because there are all sorts of connections among all 4 stakeholders without any single actor serving a very central role. So it's these sort of figures that we're looking for to determine whether or not a network is centralized or decentralized. And then we would also call the connection between 2 different kinds of actors. So the light blue and the dark blue, we would call it a diverse connection because in this instance, they may be serving 2 different roles in the seed system, right? A seed producer working with a seed researcher or any other sort of combination you could imagine. And then with these basic understandings of what it is that we're really looking for in this network, the question is, how do you actually analyze a network of interdependent relationships? And from what everything else I'll show you in this presentation is using network analysis to tell us statistically whether or not these formations are more or less present in the seed network. So is it centralized or decentralized? Is it diverse or not? So I'm going to present these results at sort of the national, regional, and individual scale and highlight some of the themes that the analyses of these networks gave us. And so I'll have up at the top sort of a reminder of what the resilience definitions named as the goals. And so for the case of the national scale, it seemed that centralized information and decentralized supply chain and genetic networks were a goal based on the definitions. So what do we actually see? The visualization here is sort of the national scale full network, right? We had 344 actors in total. So even though only 100 some folks answered the survey, because they name other people, that's how sort of a network emerges, and you have more than 300 actors all over the country connected by more than 800 different connections. And as I flip through these results, you'll see the visualizations will shift a little bit to show you what these formations look like and give you a sense of how we're all connected. And so what we find from analyzing the network data is that the information network, so if you remember the question about information, it was asking, who do you collaborate with on research projects with, get information from, share information with. And so that's what's demonstrated here. And what the analysis tells us is that the information network is centralized, meaning that there are a few major hubs across the country that are widely used. And this meets the resilience goal because it helps all the actors to connect to the same information. So like I said, something like this conference is one reason why the network is centralized at the national level, because there are spaces that many seed stakeholders use that bring us all together and get us talking about these issues. The supply chain, however, is decentralized, meaning that there are a large number of supply chain partners across the country, and there's not a lot of vertical integration. And so this is also meeting the goals of stakeholder definitions of a resilient seed system. And the genetic network at the national level is also decentralized, again, sort of meeting the goals as one resilience definition stated, that seeds should be stored by a bunch of people in different places so that the genetics can be retained and improved over time. And so at the national scale, we'll more or less just say that it's looking good. It's looking like we're matching what the vision is, and that the national level network is really is pretty well balanced as far as where the centers of power are and how they can help us move information efficiently, but not become so consolidated or so concentrated. And so just sort of summarizing, thinking about how to leverage the national network, I'm also drawing a little bit of data from the surveys generally, so not just the networks, but we talked, I've been talking to a lot of seed producers and companies over the past 2 years. And when I think about leveraging the national seed network, I think that the central sources of information that we have should really be focusing on providing information to connect stakeholders with seed and supply chain resources. So what I mean by that is that one of the big benefits of having centralized information sources across the country is that they can help inform users about other kinds of resources that are accessible to them in their region. So I think, like Deborah said, who's responsible for this decentralization? I think in some ways, centralized information sources can be partly responsible for informing actors in different regions, like where their resources are, and sort of funnel people to the right regional channels instead of kind of maintaining that concentration for all of the resources, saying we have all the information and we have all the seed and we'll actually be your buyer and your processor, although it's a very rare case. But so to say that these big information hubs should really work on a few projects where the seed system is still struggling. So data from these surveys also talk about how having full information about variety availability is still a challenge for many organic seed producers and growers. And so one point of these information hubs is that there's still a need for some sort of improved centralized source of information on organic variety availability. And similarly, I think that information hubs could really benefit by sharing how stakeholders can get connected to their regional networks for infrastructure and equipment needs. All right, so we've sort of, Kara.
Hi, I just thought before we got into regional, we might answer a couple of the questions in the chat, if that's okay.
Yes.
And so one was, someone's curious why you decided to develop definitions of resilience from the producers themselves instead of using more academic definitions.
Yeah, I think I was pleasantly surprised by how similar the producer definitions were to academic definitions. This is something I study a lot, the theory of what is resilience to so many different people and at so many different scales. And part of my future work will be matching these two a little bit more and seeing where they may or may not align. But sort of in this preliminary go, I thought that seed producers actually did an incredible job of covering a lot of the bases of what academic theory says a resilient system should be. So I decided to center them instead of academic voices, because the end result was about the same and it felt a lot more meaningful to center producer voices.
Very cool. Very cool. Another question is it possible for something to be decentralized yet still hierarchical? I guess I'm thinking of a bunch of contract growers to a relatively high number of seed distribution companies and the power dynamics present in that potentially hurting the resiliency of the system.
Yeah, this is a great point. And you will maybe notice already that there's lots of dimensions being presented here, right? We have scale, geographic scales from national to the individual. We have different kinds of connections from information, supply chain, and genetic. And then I've chosen to really zero in on centralization as one piece of this conversation. mostly just because to add a few more dimensions would be a little hard to take in an hour. But that does not mean that decentralization is sort of the answer or is the only thing that matters to creating a resilient system. I think it's meeting multiple goals at once. So it has to be maybe decentralized and diverse, and we could add more elements in there as far as power not being too integrated or concentrated in certain ways, like the example that you gave with different contract growers. And I would love input on, what is the variable that might make decentralization still not resilient? And so how do we add that into our thinking and add that to the definition so that we can include that in this assessment?
Very, very cool. And one other one I think you've answered, and it will continue to answer, which is there any indication of what type of information they want to be centralized, which I think you just did for the national level. It's interesting to acknowledge that each region is different and faces different challenges while still wanting information knowledge to be an international scale thing. So I think that might be a good segue to the next section.
Yeah, because these are just some examples of how we want some centralization, right? Because we want some shared knowledge, like what would be more efficient for us to all know or to all have access to, such as large databases or sort of these co-op databases. But it's been a fun mind game to think about. There's always a threshold of when efficiency becomes, it can be really good, and then it can also work against the goal. And there's sort of an arc or some relationship there that is even theoretically hard to unpack. But as we go through the regional dynamics, I'll be interested to see if a more specific question or thought emerges on that. So let's get into the regional scale results. Great. So let's recall that the regional goal, and this is potentially, again, a work in progress, and I really like all the questions here because this is not the end all be all or the perfect, this is a resilient system, but these are the ideas that were presented and do generally align with theory. So we're going to run with it for now, which is that the goal is to have sort of centralized information and supply chains and decentralized genetic networks. And so we're going to take a start by looking at the Western region. Well, as you may have noticed in the data collection, most of the whole seed system is based in the West, at least for seed producers and companies. So to start, this is the biggest sort of chunk of actors. And you'll notice that, so this is the Western region, which means that there are actors who are based in this region, but they can still make connections to other parts of the country, which is what makes this analysis interesting and challenging, right? So these are the actors who are based in the West and the connections that they make to other regions. And so what do we learn about their information and supply chain connections? The West generally has a pretty centralized source of information. So there's only a few hubs of information. The supply chains are decentralized, which doesn't quite fit the definition that we first laid out. And just sort of a reminder that, why might we want decentralized supply chains in each region? As one definition put it, they said that, the public and farmers should have the ability, infrastructure, and systems in place to supply the needs of gardeners and farmers in a given area. So one way of interpreting this is that you want to have access, and enough centralization so that it's sort of easy for everyone to have access. But I've been debating with myself back and forth whether or not we think regional supply chains should be centralized or decentralized. And so feel free to chime in there. And what it really means to have access and ability and infrastructure widespread for a different region. But from a genetic perspective, the genetics are also pretty widely distributed, so no single hub for where folks are getting seed or sourcing germplasm from, which is consistent with the definition. And so all in all, I don't want to harp too much on like the West is or is not resilient, because as I said, this is a very work in progress, but I instead want to highlight like what each region seems to have going for them, and maybe what maybe we could probe a little more to figure out whether or not there are areas for improvement. So based on these results, we're thinking that the West has really useful and centralized information hubs and a really large number of seed and germplasm sources. Supply chain may be too decentralized, but this takes some more digging and some conversation. And what about the North Central region? So this was the second largest region that we had data from. And here we had also a centralized source of information. We see that the supply chain is also decentralized, so very much like the West. But because this is a smaller, at least like a smaller set of people, one comment in our surveys from a North Central seed producer when commenting on the supply chain just noted, like, I'm pretty isolated out here. I don't have a lot of supply chain connections. And so that sort of adds to the conversation of, is this good or bad for the resilience of the system? And from a genetic perspective, there's actually not as many sources, or there are sort of only a few centralized sources of where North Central seed producers are getting their genetic material. So in total, we're sort of saying that the North Central has really useful information hubs, but the supply chain may be too centralized and the seed and germplasm source perhaps too centralized, according to the definitions that we've laid out. The Northeast in our survey, again, we're sort of going smaller and smaller by network size. So this has 93 actors present, and you can see a lot of connections from the Northeast out to the West and to some extent the North Central region. And here, this is the first information network that we see that's actually decentralized, so sort of no single hub or few hubs of information in the Northeast area. There's a decentralized supply chain, so again, not a major hub, but you do see that the Northeast has quite a hub for genetic material, which may not be all that surprising. And so we see that the Northeast is home to major seed hubs, but supply chain and information sources may be too decentralized. And last, we have the South, which is the smallest of all of our networks with a total of only 61 actors. And there is centralization of information here. So, a few sources of information, but we have a pretty sparse network, like I've mentioned. The supply chain here is actually centralized, but I will note that also in our survey data, we found that in the South, or the Southern region in particular, finding seed cleaning equipment and sort of other infrastructural support was really a top challenge for Southern seed producers, which is one of the pieces that makes me wonder of whether or not decentralized, or rather centralized supply chains is actually a good goal, or is that causing problems for being able to find and source the right amount of equipment? And lastly, from a statistical perspective, the South really had neither centralized nor decentralized genetic networks. It was pretty much even across the board. So really didn't go one way or the other. And in total, it's kind of looking like the South is resilient, but really quite small. And so I would argue that we might need to have more data points here before really determining the shape, because network structures are really influenced by the size of them, and the smaller they are, the easier it is to sort of look centralized, but maybe not actually provide the resilience features that we're interested in. And so that was a lot about the regions, but I do want to talk a little bit about the individual scale before going over some takeaways. So if you remember the goal at the individual scale, our last and final scale here, is that the individual scale should show us connections with diverse people, both from inside and outside the region. And so diverse people, as a reminder, I'm thinking specifically about different actor types. So this means that seed producers are making connections with actors who are not other seed producers. So that means maybe they're collaborating with a researcher, or maybe they get a lot of information from different nonprofit organizations. So diverse people has a really specific definition in this research. And also thinking about there should be a balance between creating these network connections both within and outside of their networks. And what's being visualized here is the same network we've been looking at, so all of these different connections, but now it is colored by different kinds of actors, which I won't get too specific into all of the different kinds. But I just wanted to show us that there are a lot of diverse groups present in this system, right? Even though we heard from seed producers and companies, they mention a lot of other actors that sort of are pretty easy to see how many different types of actors or how diverse the actors are in this network through these colors. And so the way that we can really think about diversity at the individual level is through the average percentage of connections that any one actor makes to other regions. So I'm presenting percentages in this table by region and sort of summarizing what that means. There's, again, many ways to slice these data, but I want to emphasize pretty much how many connections are going to diverse actors, so an actor unlike yourself, and what percentage of the connections are going to other regions. And in the West, we see that they have pretty high actor diversity, among some of the highest. So there's lots of different kinds of actors operating in the Western region, but they are the most regionally insular, meaning that they're reaching out less than any other region to others, potentially because they're quite large and have all the resources they need. But so their connections to other regions are smaller compared to others. In the North Central region, they have a pretty medium actor diversity, so about 55% of their connections, and they're pretty nationally connected, as are the Northeast and the South, meaning that they tend to reach out to other regions more than, say, the West, and more than half the time, so more than 60% of the time, all of these actors are reaching out to others. The Northeast has the lowest actor diversity, just so there are fewer different types of actors connecting in this network. And the South also has pretty high actor diversity. So a lot of different, companies, universities, seed producers, seed banks, all different kinds of actors are present in the South as well. Which this diversity question and seeing a pretty split diversity on both the different kinds of people and the different connections to regions, I just wanted to pull out a few different quotes from our surveys that sort of show the tension that diversity is great and so is having redundancy and peer networks. One grower said you just can't beat bouncing ideas or problems of other growers who are in a similar situation, right? So peer networks and talking to folks who are not necessarily diverse from us, but have a very similar experience within our region can be really helpful. So we wouldn't want 100% of our connections to be to other kinds of people. But other respondents also say, I think it's important that we step out of everyday sources for information, right? That we do sometimes need to talk to experts, that we do need to sometimes hear from other regions. And so in all, I think we see a pretty good split of connections to diverse people and connections to other regions across all of the regions. And so some summary points for thinking about improving or talking about regional networks. I first want to point out that each region has a really great mix of centralized and decentralized systems with a diversity of actors, and that this is really different than the conventional seed sector, at least as far as I know. I once thought I wanted to do a network analysis of the conventional seed sector, but it's nearly impossible. But I would imagine it isn't nearly as decentralized or nearly as diverse as what the organic seed system is showing in these data. So that's something to just sort of highlight and I want to center. And sort of these discussions of improvements and resilience is certainly more of a conversation starter than a hard and fast recommendation. But what we see in the West is that they have really centralized information hubs, which kind of like at the national scale can help guide stakeholders to the larger amount of seed and supply chain resources, but they are not reaching out to other regions as much, so they could potentially be slightly less insular. The North Central region is potentially in need of a stronger regional seed network, particularly like the genetic and germplasm exchange, and could potentially diversify the actors more in their network. But I have not been to any of these sessions that I note, but I did sort of note some seed grower conference sessions that you can either listen to the recording of or attend that are pretty relevant to these topics. So I think some folks that would technically fall in the North Central region are doing a learning from participatory grower network session. Then in the Northeast, I think that stakeholders rely a lot on other regions, and they could do with building regionally central information hubs. So they were one of the few spots where information was not very centralized and could also stand to diversify the actors in the network. And in the South, I think that generally this region could expand. So it's just so much smaller than the other regional actors. So more actors could help strengthen the network, and that we potentially need more regionally central supply chains and information sources. But there are a few different chats going on about thinking about what the Southeast Seed Network is. There's a cool lightning talk on some programs that have developed on the Community Seed Network. And so if you flip through the agenda, there are plenty of networking and network and all sorts of regional conversations that hopefully can you can link back to this and let me know how you think they can help inform sort of the future of this research. And I'm getting close to wrapping up, and some of the few things I do just want to highlight, definitely the limitations of this research, which is that these data are only a sample of the network, right? These are based on seed producer and company responses to a survey we sent out. And we're still building a picture of this system by, we'll eventually be putting together more responses from the surveys, but this will not ever be a complete story. And so it's worth recognizing that this is merely a sample. Setting goals for the seed system should be, I think, more of a participatory activity. The resilience definition has really helped us take a look at what these voices are. But I'd like to continue to hear from different voices. So including anyone on this call, if you feel like you want to share your definition, it can be integrated into this data set quite easily. There are some data privacy concerns with generating networks that are this detailed, which I'll just put a flag in if anyone wants to talk about. And analyzing data across scales is really challenging. It's no easy task. It's hard to wrap our head around. Maybe this is why no one does much systems level data or systems level analysis, but it is something that I'm actively working on and interested in feedback about. And so some summary points that I'll read briefly are that systems level research can help us think about supporting more resilient seed networks from the national to the regional scale, but there isn't a whole lot of systems level work being done. Seed producers and companies helped us define a resilient seed system as a system that strikes the balance of having a decentralized seed network that centers around the regional level, involving diverse seed and people, while maintaining enough connectedness to support efficient flows of information and resources across the country. And our survey of seed producers and companies allowed us to visualize and analyze a sample of the seed system network, which showed us that there is a pretty resilient seed system at the national scale. So it's a network with centralized information sources and decentralized supply chain and genetic networks. And across regions, I think we're still sort of sorting that out, but there are opportunities where the seed network could be grown or diversified. And so I want to give a quick thanks to, of course, Organic Seed Alliance for hosting this conference, for partnering with me in this data collection for many years, and it's been a really great experience so far. This work has also been funded by Western SARE graduate student grants, as well as some support from UC Davis's Muir Institute and the Center for Environmental Policy and Behavior. And so with that, I have a few questions that we could tackle if anyone wanted. I don't know if there are things in the chat that we could go over if that was of interest, but I am, as I've mentioned throughout this presentation, curious to know what folks think a resilient seed system is, what we think the goals of the organic seed system should be, and how that might translate across scales. And for your own takeaways, how can understanding your region's seed networks help you in your work with seed? And I'm also interested if anyone has ideas sort of on that note for turning this kind of analysis into a tool. It's something I've been thinking about for a while. Would you want access to these data if it could be private and really privatized or anonymized except for you? And is there a way that this sort of thing could be helpful, or what kind of conversation does it start or things does it bring up for you? So yeah.
Sounds great. And Rue, I see your hand up, and I just wanted to really quickly get to a couple questions in the chat that were about the data set. And, survey, why, asking why the survey didn't include Alaska or Puerto Rico or Texas and Kansas. And I think it'd just be good to talk about how broad the outreach was and how than, where the people came from that did respond.
Mhm. Yeah, that was a good question. I did not mention where our sort of population came from in our list of more than 500 seed producers and companies, which the original database we used was the National Organic Program database. And we pulled, so being a seed producer is actually a bit of a hard category to define, at least in the form of a database. There isn't an exact database of that group. And so we looked for any producer who was certified organic, who listed seed as a crop or a product, and not seed like sunflower seeds, but seeds. And so I don't know if Alaska or Puerto Rico were in our population. I could double check that, but they were not really, it was not trying to stick to just the mainland continent. I think it was just a nature of who responded, and there may have been one or two on our list who never responded to that. Also, our maps are sort of shrunk. We have a few international respondents, but for the sake of mapping and not taking up a whole slide, there were some visual cues that were cut off, but not left out of the actual analytical component of the analysis.
All right, thanks for that. Rue, did you have a question?
Yeah, I don't want to take it off the track of the discussion questions that you put up, Liza, but I guess something that came to mind while I was listening was thinking about the fact that and I should first say this was a really wonderful presentation. I think this is really great work. So thank you for bringing it to this conference. When you focus on seed producers and companies, that's obviously one segment of people within the seed system, and within that set of people, there are going to be certain shared understandings of resilience that came out of your survey, and I am curious about, I guess, two different takes on that. One is, so I wonder if you had asked what an equitable seed system would look like, what kinds of responses there would be. And I would argue that a resilient seed system is going to be equitable, but in a short scale, we know that it might not be. So the time scale makes a difference there as well. And then also if you asked a different group of people, such as farmers who depend on seed, what a resilient seed system is, you would obviously get a different set of responses. And with the equity question, I guess partly what I'm thinking about there is people's access to land, people's access to the ability to save seeds themselves. So there's a lot of different players in the seed system, and I recognize that you can't answer all those questions with your research, but I'm just curious as to how you think about those kinds of questions.
Yeah, it sounds like there are two big themes, so I'll take one at a time. One is it's sort of this why resilient and not anything else, and that word could capture a certain perspective, but miss a completely different perspective. And that is certainly a drawback of the design. But at least what I'll say has been nice. We did only ask for one open form response. So we don't have a parallel look at how a slightly different tweaked concept might be interpreted. But I think I do appreciate, and I'm glad, this is what I wanted for respondents who kind of read it and more or less took it as I'm going to put whatever I envision for the seed system in this space. So at least issues like equity and long-term thinking, they all got loaded in there. A lot of these definitions are, paragraphs long with sort of everything you could ever want in a seed system mentioned. And so, of course, I think by choosing to use the word resilient, we certainly lost something, right, in what that evoked for people. But I am hoping that it evoked at least, it was a starting point, and I guess actually easier, the network stuff would be harder to recreate, but I think getting different definitions or different angles of what do you envision for an equitable seed system, what do you envision for a resilient system, for whatever word you want to put in there, that could be something we keep polling and asking people about pretty easily. And so could kind of shift the goals based on what we learn from those future research questions. And as for multiple responses, so yes, these definitions are defined largely by seed producers and companies. And I am excited for this research is really going to keep building. So ask all your questions because it'll help me know where to go. But we have these responses from some other groups. So from seed researchers in particular right now, their definitions are a lot more technical. And so one day I'll sort of integrate those, and everyone on this call can sort of be on the lookout that I'll be doing a snowball sample of this survey. So everyone who is named in this network, hopefully by the summer, will get a survey. So if you haven't taken the survey yet and you were mentioned by someone else, you then get to take the survey. And so that means we'll get to hear from different NGOs, from researchers and producers and growers, and anyone who got named on that list, but we haven't yet heard from, we're gonna ask you to. And so eventually we'll have a much more dynamic structure. We'll integrate more voices. We'll have more perspectives from the network and more perspectives on the definition itself that will sort of grow as the data grows. Yeah. And if I missed something in your question, feel free to ask again.
Yeah, any other questions or anyone that wants to respond to the discussion questions that Liza has posted? They've got me thinking. Feel free to raise your hand or jump in the chat or just unmute yourself. We're a small enough group, we can deal with that. I'm curious, Liza, about what a tool for stakeholders would look like, and what, whether it's, I'm just thinking of some of the tools that we have that have helped in some ways with centralizing information. So like the seed linked tool has helped in getting some variety information out and getting feedback in and centralizing information. So I'm just curious about a tool, related to the networks and stakeholders, what that would look like.
Yeah, and I'm curious, so I think it is, if generally sort of fun to know where you fit in on that network and to sort of get a sense of, am I missing something? Is there a resource? Is there a connection that everyone has or that I haven't tapped into my region? Or so the first idea of a tool is like being able to design a slightly complex web app where you could log in and see where you situate, but not without disclosing the data of other people in the network. So sort of getting a sense of, what your region looks like, what your area looks like, and how you fit into, if you've entered your network data, to get a feel for, just for how you sort of fit. But I also think I think especially when I hear challenges, like I have issues, sourcing certain equipment, or I am, maybe potentially you had some buyer and it didn't work. So where do I go next? If one of your resources falls through, where's my next option? And so sort of you can translate these network data into different databases of just saying generating something like a co-op to say, here's where equipment is actually pretty centered, or here's where we all go for this one resource, or also using it as sort of a two-way communication, like I'm in need of this, but I have this to offer. And so sort of thinking about where resources are centered and how you may be able to hook up with that if you're in need of a certain kind of resource, whether it be seed or equipment, or, a lot of people I've spoken to are just sort of feel a little isolated in the network. And I know that that's what this conference and Organic Seed Alliance does a great job of also, is connecting these dots and connecting all these actors. And so I'm just curious what other visions we can think of that would help that.
Very cool. I think it's a good topic for that next generation of seed people that have been meeting also during the conference and in this synergy spaces. So we have a question in the chat about international seed sources and partnership and anything related to bringing seeds across the borders. And so is it, how did those international participants work into this particular research? And, are there some things that make including them in these different regional seed networks sort of burdensome?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so the international actors came up mostly as they were named by someone that we surveyed in the US, and they said, I get seeds from such and such in Germany. And so they make it onto our list and they're seen as a part of someone's seed network. So they're contributing to a regional seed network in some way. But unfortunately, we couldn't get a lot of information of like how that really worked. So I'm reading the question as far as burden of bringing seed across borders is also quite a question if it's done outside of some sort of like official purchasing channel. And there is a lot to unpack there, and I don't have a great answer. I think my mind has sort of kept to the US borders, in part because movement of genetic material can get really complicated across borders. And so, but at the same time, recognizing that supply chains and information are certainly international, very internationally based, and we could really benefit from not just experiences from other regions, but from other countries, from somewhere that may be very similar to you just across a border. I'll just say I'm with you on those questions with not a lot of answers.
Yeah, I just want to note that one of the first programs we had on this platform that we're bringing this conference to everyone through was the Organic World Congress International Seed Ambassadors 2-day consortium. And it was really interesting to try to connect internationally. It's really hard to do in live time because of the time zone changes, but there's a lot of knowledge sharing that went on, and some really good I want to say one of the things you might not think about was really good marketing ideas because of some of the differences in the seed systems internationally compared to the United States. And so there were some great examples of how, for example, in Italy, they're marketing their seed, and their seed packets show the farmer who grew the seed and the regionality of that particular seed variety and why it's important in the region, and trying to create market for regional varieties. So there's a lot of really great information sharing that's happening internationally. And we're also hoping that this platform will serve as an information connector. And hopefully some of these regional seed networks will continue to meet in this space to create some of those regional connections. But I'm seeing another question about interested in hearing more about how to see a tool that will embrace the ambiguity of how regional networks should be based on central, decentral information structures. Since in your presentation, you provided some uncertainty about whether it was a positive or negative growth point for each region. So can you define how the conclusion per user may take this data so that it can be useful for them?
Yeah, so on the individual level, like if you had a tool that was geared towards a single user, it's a little harder to think about centralization and decentralization, since those are actually like network tendencies. You can be a central user, but it's a lot easier to talk about like how many connections you have, who they're to, how far they span. So I think that a tool would really focus on those questions. And maybe even as a way of saying, I can log in and I can see myself, Liza, and the tool can tell me that, like, at least according to the network, I'm only connected to, like, maybe I'm a seed producer and I have 2 seed producer information connections and 1 seed source and 1 supply chain connection. And I could imagine a tool that would say, look, Liza, compared to others in your region, sort of anonymously and in aggregate, like you have a lot fewer connections than others, or you might benefit from getting information from, a more diverse range of sources, or here you only have 1 supply chain connection. Here are similar ones in your region that could maybe help you have a backup or build in redundancy into your individual role in this seed system. And so that's how I imagine a tool, one of the ways potentially interacting with a user. that doesn't quite get into this, this ambiguity of when centralization versus decentralization is good or bad. And these are really loaded words, but I think that I would envision maybe sorting that out, maybe not building in the ambiguity to the tool, but maybe trying to sort it out prior to that. So deepening these definitions and deepening these sort of conditionals of when it works and when it doesn't, before trying to implement this into a tool. But of course, I don't think any tool would have so much of this is complicated and relative. So it's a hard and fast recommendation would of course always be caveated, but I think, those are two levels of answers there.
Yeah, I'm curious about how the supply chain failures during the pandemic, how those could inform that regional centrality notion. And although we're talking about just seed, the food system pieces and the seed people were not able to get seed from national outfits that they used to be able to get seed from necessarily. And so we had more people come into the seed library and other local sources. So it's interesting to think about. And we've got another question in the chat. Question comment about Canada here. There's a fairly robust seed network and organizations nationally in Canada, but the jurisdictional border prevents a lot of potential exchange between growers in US and Canada. I do research at the scale of the Lake Superior watershed crossing all borders. So this is something I think a lot about. Interesting comment. Yeah, I mean, it's as far as seed's concerned, that doesn't care about borders, but the people who control the borders care about seed.
Yeah, and thinking of natural, I mean, just sort of to go off that comment, so much of so I work in a lab with people and we all kind of study different natural resources, but they all have similar problems. Like if you're studying a watershed or studying groundwater management, so many of environmental resources don't actually care about borders. And when we think about what even just a resilient system is, from wanting to be diverse in whatever its agricultural production is, the landscape doesn't care that there's an imaginary border there. You still want to have diverse agricultural systems on both sides. And it definitely complicates things. And even as someone who's trying to understand all of the legal and regulatory differences across borders, like that adds a whole other layer of burden to think about how do we manage this resource that also is not just that works best for everyone, but is amenable to different policy and regulatory contexts, is tough. And I see there is what do we mean by a tool is definitely a question. I think because these data there's so much to like interact with, and it can be so personal. I really do imagine, and like I would love a website that someone could log on to and sort of get their little like network profile and look at regional resources and be able to explore the data in an anonymized way. But that's more so my like fun computer sciencey brain thinking, and that's one of the reasons I'm asking, because I don't know if that sounds fun to anyone else, or if like a workbook or a workshop or whatever it is actually sounds a lot more reasonable. So.
All right, we're getting some action in the chat on that.
Okay, sounds reasonable.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I just like to make like a very poorly worded comment, question, rambling. So in terms of a resilient seed system, something that came to mind is accessibility. And I guess what I mean by that is both genetic accessibility and then, well, yeah, mostly genetic. But then that in terms of how the system itself can adapt and how different genetic like evolutionary pathways can adapt. And this, I'm coming from a background in research in intellectual property rights, and I'm also curious about what you think about the open source initiative and where that fits into all of this. And so, yeah, that is my rambling that I'm not going to take much further because I just have 4,000 thoughts and none of them are cohesive. But thank you for this presentation.
I'm with you on the 4,000 thoughts and trying to make them cohesive and having an audience to try to do that with. But so related, unrelated, is that like asking folks where they get seed from is the trickiest of all the questions, right? I mean, not everyone wants to answer this question, but for some people it's a very sensitive question, and I want to respect that. But I also think that there is like a collective benefit to understanding where seed is from and how it's accessed and who has access to it. And if, I think that it was the question most unlikely for people to answer because it feels private. And so I guess something I've just been thinking about in this research is just sort of this ingrained, like wanting to keep our sources of germplasm private or our seed stock private, and because it has value to us. And like, how do we honor that and respect that and say that that is absolutely like, it's a valuable thing and you want to allow that to be maintained, while also saying, but look at all the collective benefits that we can have from understanding and improving access to seed. But I'm hesitant to say more because I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of the intellectual property components of seed. I am really fascinated by the open source seed initiative from like a seeds as commons perspective. And a different arm of my research, if you want to check in a year, is actually picking apart university and industry licensing contracts. So thinking about who universities are doing some breeding, what are they breeding, who do they license it to, how do they license it or patent it or pledge it or not, and just trying to wrap my head around those pathways and who that serves in a sense, which is a different thing than the networks, but is a question of like what kinds of protections are benefiting whom. And I know that there's a lot of research that starts to get at this, but I still think there's an outstanding question of when protections can be helpful and when they can be harmful. And I'm hesitant to say more exacts on my opinions on that in this moment.
Thank you. I also just very quickly wanted to mention it would be very cool to see where gardeners fit into all of this. I think that that's a really kind of underestimated sector of seed growers, and it would be interesting to see how that affects a resilient seed system in your research.
Yeah, and there's so much genetic material, being moved around at the gardener level that it's just so hard as a person who wants to collect data in a structured way. If anyone has any good ideas on, the National Organic Program database is an easy starting point because it's something publicly available and it is in theory comprehensive, but it of course omits the much less formal or still formal, but differently kind of formal, not as regulated group. So
you might
want ideas.
You might look to the Seed Savers Exchange Community Seed Project because they show gardeners that are saving seed all over the place, and have some great resources to share. All right. Couple notes about this app. I don't know, Abba, did you want to share about that app? It sounds kind of interesting.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the initiatives that I help steward with the WC Food Systems program is the Cascadia Grains Conference. And so we connected through COVID with a lot of the similar initiatives across the country who were focused on regional stable crop economies and rebuilding those. And one of the groups that kind of carried the torch through this time is the Appalachian Staple Foods Collaborative. And I just went back and checked to see if my link was still active, but they had used that Some app platform. They got a grad student, they got a couple $1,000s to put it together. They sent us individualized links. We created profiles, and it did exactly what you're talking about, Liza, to show the connections. And you recognize a lot of folks on there. And literally mapping and showing you lines of connection. But I think the one thing is just like making sure that there's a sustainable plan in place for managing it. And because they didn't have one. So it's now it no longer exists for me, but that platform was really cool. And I think kind of hits on the head of what you were thinking about, Liza, for just graphically showing where the connections were. I'm not sure if it had the capability of spitting out any kind of data in terms of like where you're at in relation to the collective, but it was a little cumbersome because you had to be emailed an individual link to join it. which brings up technological access barriers and all kinds of other questions. But I just wanted to put that out there in case it's a useful resource for you in the future. But definitely thinking about who's going to manage it is, I'm sure, on your mind as well as you kind of design for the future.
Yeah, and that's something that even comes up in this, having centralized information sources. And one of the reasons it's so valuable is like, one, that it's centralized and then potentially easier to access, but centralized sources often have longer maintenance modes and, maybe have the resources to sustain these sorts of things, which, some of the various database needs that I mentioned, like some have emerged before, but they haven't really thrived. And an undercurrent question for me is why, maybe it's about maintenance. How do you get people to jump on the bandwagon of any one given, centralized data source? All of these things sort of come up for me as to be figured out.
To be figured out. And another note in the chat is, in addition to, a little conversation earlier about how equity fits into resiliency, is a note that don't we need transparency to be really knowledgeable? And so some of the connections aren't transparent. And I know some of the data isn't transparent. We've been trying to get yield data on some from some seed companies, and they can give it to us, but they have to go through all these different permissions in order to give it. So in other words, it's not transparent. You might be able to get it. So just wanted to raise that up from the chat.
Yeah, just to comment on this tension between, I think that the organic seed community is so much more willing to be transparent generally, at least I could talk about trying. Before starting with organic, I tried to propose this whole project to some conventional seed folks and got shut down very easily. Like, will not even mention the word seed to you, really. It's so private that we will not, like so many non-disclosure agreements and things, which is interesting. Being at UC Davis, as an aside, is really quite a biotech and conventional hub. And so I've gotten to just be present in some of those meetings, kind of like a fly on the wall, and very different levels of transparency. And one thing I really appreciate about the organic seed community is that there is sort of this vision that that in order to be really knowledgeable, we do have to be transparent with one another and rely on our communities, as opposed to sort of put all of our walls up and do our own thing.
Absolutely. All right, well, we've got to close out this session.